their branches, we'd pick their fruit, and some of us even hug them. Trees are our friends, and nobody really knows these guys better than PK. Currently Senior Curator and Director of Outreach at Denver Botanic Gardens, where Panayoti has worked since 1980. We always joked about him being the longest employee at the gardens. Panayoti began his career as curator of the Rock Alpine Garden, which is the signature garden at the Denver Botanic Gardens, that showcases thousands of plants from around the world, many introduced to horticulture by Panayoti through Plants to Let program, in which he was one of the original architects. So those plants that you see at the nursery that say Plant Select on it, thank this guy for it, because he really was enormously instrumental in that program. Panayoti has discovered many plants and has explored much of North America, including Mexico, the Andes, in Chile and Argentina, Eurasia from Spain to Mongolia. He has traveled 6 times in South Africa, concentrating on Drakensberg Mountains and Karoo. He has lectured in over 120 cities in 10 countries. He has received numerous honors, including the Scott Medal of Swarthmore Arboretum and Liberty High Bailey Award of the American Horticultural Society, both generally considered the top honors for horticulturalists in the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please help me welcome Panayoti Kelaidis.
Well, where was my recorder? I needed to take that back for my performance review. Thank you all for coming. It's great to be in Boulder County, where I grew up, and it's great to give the first talk I've ever given on trees. I was thinking about it. It's a little odd. Of course, you heard my background is alpine plants. I've done a lot with xeric plants. So what am I talking about trees for? Well, you'll see that trees were one of my first loves. And we go way back, just like we do for all of you, I suspect, because we all know that the trees produce the oxygen we breathe, and they produce much of the food that we consume, and they produce the fuel that we burn, much of them traditionally not just from firewood, but prehistorically, the trees that produce the oil, the petroleum that we use. If you think about it, almost everything we do goes back to trees. So I need to get back to Kim, though. She's about to sneak off. And before she goes off, I want to say something special about her. We did work together, and she was at the Botanic Gardens in a period of 10 years of our greatest growth ever. So, and she was in the department that propelled that growth. So I wanted to give you a little hint. Watch out. I think you're in for some wonderful times with her, because I think she helped propel our visitorship from 400,000 to 1.5 million. And so she's very clever with what she does. And I'm thrilled to see where she has been. I have not been to this institution before, but I'm very impressed with what I see right now. And yeah. I would say offhand that, and I think it's very clever and very wonderful that this institution has decided to feature trees, because we take them so much for granted. And this is a picture I happened to photograph when I was out on a tree reconnaissance that I'll be talking about in a few minutes, and I'm awfully glad I got it, because I think it captures something about that kids really get trees in ways that we often don't. And if you think back at your childhood, I'm sure that you had numerous encounters of all kinds, including falling out of trees, I suspect. And I do think it's important that we think about trees because of our kids, because, of course, many of the trees that we're planting today may not be around because of changes in the climate, because of all sorts of other issues. When I was a child, the elm was still common in the Denver area. We'll be ending with the elm as well, because there's some interesting things that have transpired. But these are all dead elms. The ones on the right-hand side are 2 views of the American Champion Elm. And on the left-hand side, as you can see, there's a gigantic elm that was removed shortly thereafter. And this was a spectacle that occurred all over the United States from the 1930s when the Dutch elm disease first entered America to the present day where elms are still dying. And of course now many of you are aware that Boulder County was the first place where the emerald ash borer occurred. So there are these pestilences that occur because whether we like it or not, a lot of people like to blame horticulturists, but in fact these both the Dutch elm disease and the emerald ash borer came through with wood that was imported to the United States that was for furniture purposes or with pallets. So horticulture had nothing to do with either of those pestilences, but they will occur, and so we need to be vigilant. And at any rate, this is one of the things that inspired me as a child because the park next to which I grew up was full of elms, and they all were cut down. So what was once a beautiful sort of a forest setting became a rather parched and scary place. The other thing that really, really impacted me as a kid was growing up and spending a lot of time in the summer near where I was born in the Yampa River Valley. And in the 1930s, there was a huge windstorm that knocked down tens of thousands of trees, and there was an explosion of a spruce beetle that destroyed and killed every spruce tree on the White River Plateau, the flat tops. So I grew up going to the flat tops, and they were completely gray. And it was due to this little creature, the spruce beetle. And that spruce beetle is rampaging right now through much of our mountains, because when trees become stressed, the beetle number can explode. And this is what the flat tops looked like back in the 1950s and 60s when I was a young kid. And I'd go up there fishing. The fish were great because they were really big because they ate the beetles. And, so it was great for fishing, but it wasn't so good for scenic beauty. There was an even bigger wind blow about 15 years ago in the Park Range, and this is now happening throughout much of the Northern Park Range as well. So these disastrous destructions of our trees made me aware, and I became very obsessed. This is a picture I drew when I was about 12 or 13 years old, and I was in love with trees. I actually did, I was trying to find to copy a picture of it. I did a book on the trees of Boulder way back then, and I redacted it when I was a teenager and changed it all. And so it's kind of cute. But I was very interested in finding unusual trees, and I was drawing trees like crazy. And some of you may be like that. I just got these drawings back because my brother-in-law passed away a couple months ago, and he and my sister had saved all of these drawings I had done as a child. And I was very touched to see all these renderings of trees and realizing that that was one of the things that got me really passionate about plants when I was a child. But all of us, I think, and for a moment I just would like to have you sort of ponder in your own life and realize that the vistas that we gather, this is in the Sierra Nevada, where we were staying with a friend of ours looking at a sunset through some of the native oaks there. We have these vistas here in California looking through a palm tree. We all have these vistas that are framed by trees that go through our lives. And we're all fascinated by the bees, the 3 or 4 bees that keep us through the winter, right? Berries, bark, branches. You know, that's pretty much what we have to sustain ourselves on if we don't grow more interesting plants. And there's nothing wrong with that. And the bark of trees has an incredible pleasure and allure for anybody who has a willingness to stop. And obviously, I suspect anybody who's come to this lecture can't help. On the right-hand side, that's a madrone or madrona from the Pacific coast. We actually are growing the Arizona madrone, which has even more peely bark at the Botanic Gardens. And this is a paperbark maple on the left-hand side. There are beautiful specimens of that at Denver Botanic Gardens and even better ones at the Regis Arboretum, if you've never been to the Regis University in North Denver. And on the right-hand side, that's a gnarly a trunk of a maple that I took at Filoli. We'll be visiting Filoli again in a minute. This is a tree I love. This is the famous Chinese pepper tree, the huaqiao that the Chinese use for seasoning. This is the American cousin. It also occurs in the southern United States, and it's hardy. I've actually grown that at Denver Botanic Gardens. And that's a tree that you probably don't want to try and climb. I don't think. And then there's things like these giant yuccas. If you enter Denver Botanic Gardens at the entrance, you'll see this Yucca faxoniana, which is now almost 20-some feet tall, almost 30 feet tall. We don't think of yuccas as being trees, but in fact, they are. And in nature, there are yuccas that can get up to 50, 60 feet tall in the southwestern United States and Mexico. So trees come in all kinds. These are ardesias that I photographed in California. This is a tree that potentially is hardy. It actually comes from China, but has beautiful red berries. The berries of many of these trees are wonderful. Toyon on the right-hand side, and even the junipers and the cypresses. That's actually a cypress on the left-hand side. And there are hardy cypresses. We grow quite a few species, the Arizona cypress and also the Modoc cypress. And fruit, left-hand side, that's a persimmon, the Chinese persimmon. That's photographed in my brother's yard in California. And on the right-hand side, that's a Chinese pear, a rare species of pear. Just to remind you that how beautiful and varied these qualities of fruit that we all love. And almost any place you go, there's something lovely. This is the top of Mount Tamalpais in the Bay Area. And this is a rare cypress that only occurs along the coast ranges there, Sargent's cypress. And there it is on the left-hand side. And here's a pine I found on the same hike there on Mount Tam a few years ago. So everywhere I go, I photograph, and my photographic files are just full of hundreds and hundreds of pictures that most people would just think are green blobs. But for me, that's the memory of these trees that we go through life. And some of us gather all sorts of mementos and souvenirs. We take, we buy postcards, or we buy this or that. For me, it's the trees that I love to remember. And of course, who hasn't been to the General Sherman tree and not photographed yourself in front of it, or your companion? So these are a few trees. And on the right-hand side, again, that's one of those incredible maples at Filoli. And I don't know how many of you know Filoli. I think it's one of the most beautiful gardens. It's near, between San Francisco and San Jose. And I'm just showing that here is an estate garden. It's an extremely elegant estate garden. But what would it be without the cherry trees in the back blooming and the interesting other tree background? We take these things for granted, but a great designer like the ones who created this wonderful garden, or how about these large taxus? These are yews that are trained. They're almost 40, 50 feet tall, and they're carefully sheared, and they create these incredible alleys and vistas through this wonderful garden. And they even have a whole series of bonsai, as well as clipped hedges along the more formal sides. So I just found a few of these, and I realized how there's not a garden in the world, I don't think, that very few gardens which won't have these huge sentinels that form the backbone, and often the most spectacular elements. And then, of course, things like magnolias, when not only dramatic in the distance, but when you look at them closely. This is a Magnolia Sieboldii, a wonderful nodding flowered one. Well, this is a few of my heroes. This is a man named Al Rollinger, and he's one of the premier landscape designers of the Denver area. And in 1968, 69, he was a young man just starting his career. He didn't have a lot of business, and he decided he was going to learn about trees. He talked to the leading nurseryman at the time, was a man named Harry Swift, and he kept asking Harry, I'm sick of silver maples and poplars, and what can we grow that's really special? And he said, well, there's a few oaks and this, that, and the other. He said, I don't know, go out there and check and see what you think. So he did. He walked down every street in the metropolitan Denver area over the next several years and noted every special tree. And then he published a little book. That's it on the left-hand side. And in it, he had put the addresses, he put the height, he measured each of these trees, and he measured about 1,200 trees. And this was back in 1969, just in time for that polar vortex. They didn't call it that back then, but in 1969, we had about an 80-degree drop, and many, many trees perished at that horrible fall frost back then. But meanwhile, he made this documentary. You can see he has the most notable coloraturias. He has by each one, the larix, all the special trees, the larches, anything that was not a common poplar or not a common tree, he would make note of. And so I discovered this many, many years ago when I started the gardens almost 40 years ago. And it became kind of a Bible for me. I would go around and look up these unusual trees. And then I realized we had the 40th anniversary was coming up back in 2008. And I thought, this is my chance, 40 years to do something. So I tried to organize the volunteers, the Botanic Gardens, and my staff at the time. And it was just too big a task. But when the 50th came around, we were in a different position because by then we were working closely with the city of Denver, and we had also the master gardeners. So the last 3 years, we've had an army of people collaborating, and this is one of our forays. We usually have 3 or 4 foresters who have all the proper equipment. We have a bunch of volunteers from the Master Gardener program, and then a number of us from the Botanic Gardens. And we would fan out over a given area, and my assistant, who's in the middle, Ann Frazier, is a fantastic project manager, and so she was coordinating all of these locations, and we actually spent almost 2.5 years, and we completed the survey about 2 weeks ago. So we actually found all the trees we could out of 1,200, and we found about 60% of the trees are still there. We were able to measure them again, and we're working now on a publication that'll come out hopefully in time to celebrate the 50th anniversary of this survey. And at any rate, so this is the first time I'm having a chance to talk about it. You can see how enthusiastic we look here. That's Al Rollinger. I got to tell you, Al is one of these really, how should I put it? I'm trying to find a tactful way to put it. He's not a kind of person who shows a lot of enthusiasm, shall we say. He's very cool, you know. Well, he's not been cool. He's so excited about this whole thing. He's been on every foray, everything else. And we actually lead tours, he and I, every month. And we led one this morning to Cheeseman Park. So once a month, we lead a tour to visit the Al Rollinger trees. And he is just pleased as punch. At any rate, this is us measuring, this is an oak tree in somebody's front yard. And the oaks, by the way, have been the champions of this whole survey. And here you can see a bunch of us. We measure them at DBH is called, roughly 4 feet high. And then we measure them again, the height. We have special contraptions. And then the city people actually feed it right into a database. They have an incredible database of almost every street tree and public tree in the Denver metropolitan area. And the neighboring cities have the same thing. So we've been able to come up with some really fantastic data and very interesting data. Here you can see how monstrous some of the trees are. This is a huge tree, actually in Cheeseman Park. I just saw it this morning. A beautiful, I believe that's a linden, an American linden. And here's a pine tree, and we have these marvelous stories we gathered. The lady you see there with the red hair I don't think is authentic, because she's well into her 90s. And I'll never forget, I arrived and we wanted to measure that tree. We had to get the permission of all the homeowners, of course. So I knocked on the door, no answer. And then I kind of looked around, and there she was, puttering in her garden. And I said, "Excuse me, ma'am." And she said, "Hi," you know, she was, what do you want? I said, "We'd like to measure your tree." And she said, "Oh, please do. Measure my tree." And it turns out she's living for this tree. This tree is like, she was there, it was planted when she was a little girl, and it's now 90 years later, and she's watched that tree grow. She says, "I hope I die before this tree does." And she was just so proud of her tree, so thrilled that we were there. And you realize that all of us usually have that kind of attachment, certainly the kind of people who come to a lecture like this, but most people do. In the whole course of doing this tree survey, I was moved at how much trees matter to so many people. And you realize how much we really take them for granted. This is, of course, an eastern white pine. And it's one of Denver's, really one of its most magnificent ones, and how great that we actually have the story of the woman who's known it since it was a seedling. And so that's the kind of thing we hope to incorporate. So these are just some of trees that I have some special attachment to on the left-hand side. Those are 3 enormous Scots Pine in my backyard. They're about 70 feet tall. And on the right-hand side, that's a Whitebark Pine from Wyoming. The Whitebark Pines are succumbing, unfortunately, to white pine blister rust. So there are people who have been concerned because that blister rust has now shown up in Colorado, and it may eventually affect our Bristlecone Pines, which are some of our greatest treasures. So we're really concerned. And there's people like this gentleman who have done much, another one of my heroes. This is Jerry Morris. I don't know how many of you have heard of him, but he's probably one of the premier tree people in the world. He lives in Lakewood. This is his garden, which is full of treasures. And he grows bonsai, he grows dwarf trees. He's named over 1,000 witch's brooms. He's found all over the West, and he's taken cuttings and grafted them and seedlings. And so his plants, he's very well known in the European nursery trade. He's had whole busloads of Dutch people and Germans come to tour his garden and to have him show them around. And we're very lucky because he's been a patron of Denver Botanic Gardens since our inception. He's helped us in 100 different ways and trained many of our staff around trees. But to travel with Jerry through his garden is a great pleasure. You can see him. He'll have a different shirt in each one because I visit him and I haunt him and see his collection here. And of course, I never go there without having a few trees to take back to the Botanic Gardens. What a wonderful man. And these are some wonderful trees that he's done. Here you can see a little dwarf pinyon pine called Farmy, and that's actually a plant select plant that we've been promoting through the Plant Select program. It's a little miniature pinyon pine. Most of you know you plant a pinyon pine, it can get 20, 30 feet tall. You know, it takes its time doing it. Here's one that will probably never get more than about 4 or 5 feet tall. Totally drought tolerant. This needs no supplemental water. So it's very, very exciting to see what he's developed. And these are, there's a spruce on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, that's part of the Seven Dwarves. He named 7 different brooms for of the Colorado Bristlecone Pine. I don't think there's a Snow White, so I hope you're not disappointed. But the 7 Dwarves, everybody needs to have all 7. And so, unfortunately, I think so far the Botanic Gardens only has, you know, Sleepy and, I don't know, Grumpy, but we're working on the rest of them. But there are people who try and collect all of his brooms because they are pretty wonderful. And here's some of his bonsai. He's contributed several of the bonsai to the bonsai collection at Denver Botanic Gardens. And these are some that are still lingering in his yard, although I have a hunch they'll eventually end up with us. And here he is at Denver Botanic Gardens. That's one of the pines that he's donated to us. So you can tell that I not only like trees, I like tree people. And we have some extraordinary tree huggers in Colorado. These are all mostly Jerry Morris trees that were grafted and grown by my friend Kirk Fiesler at LaPorte Avenue Nursery. So if you visit some of the great nurseries, like here, you have wonderful nurseries in the Longmont area. Many of them will feature these trees on occasion, and we certainly have them at the Botanic Gardens sale most years. And any Jerry Morris tree is going to be a really good tree to have because they're selected usually from the Denver area or the mountains, so they're particularly hardy. And in Fort Collins, of course, they're grown in our climate, so they're much better adapted than trees that come from more humid maritime climates. This is my colleague, Mark Fusco, working on a new berm at the Botanic Gardens, which was designed for Jerry Morris conifers. And here's when it was first planted. It was sort of bleak, but it filled in pretty quickly. And we have a dwarf conifer berm where if you want to see some really special conifers, we have about 150 of Jerry Morris's selections. So we in this garden, but we have quite a few in other areas too. We have probably one of the best collections of his witch's brooms. And I show you this because to remind you that we have this season in Colorado. It lasts about 25 months, and it's called winter. And most of our gardens in winter are pretty bleak. And no, they don't have to be. You know, you remember bark, berries, branches, but also remember foliage. There's lots of evergreen plants we can use. And remember conifers, because conifers can provide a fantastic amount of ballast and interest in the winter landscape. So if you can plant enough conifers with a dusting of snow, they're absolutely magical. And so magical that the American Conifer Society designated the Jerry Morris Garden and the Botanic Gardens and us as we are one of the demonstration display gardens for the American Conifer Society. So this is the president of the Conifer Society in the background, has presented to my colleague Mike Kinchin and to Jerry Morris the plaque which has been affixed to the post there next to the garden. Something I'm very proud of. When I started at Denver Botanic Gardens, believe me, there weren't many unusual or special conifers. We've come a long way, you know. So, in addition to doing the wonderful things that he does, Jerry has taken many of us on field trips. And I don't know how many of you have been to the Limber Pine Grove in the Mosquito Range. Has anybody been up to that? There's a sign if you're going up towards Mount Sherman. On the left-hand side, it's right below tree line. You'll see a sign saying Limber Pine Grove. If you park there, it's only about maybe a mile and a half from there. You can go into a grove of limber pines. And limber pine has special significance, especially right now, because it was first found and named by Edwin James in the Front Range almost exactly 200 years ago. It was in 2020, we'll be celebrating the 200th anniversary of the Stephen Long expedition. And of course, you have the best view of Long's Peak here. And the Limber Pine Grove of the Mosquito Range is one of the great spectacles of Colorado. And I know that there are little things like the Broncos and little things that people are distracted by, you know, in their daily lives, television, and I understand there's some strange things happening in Washington. But I think that we forget sometimes that what really, really matters are trees. And I hope that someday, if you ever invite me back, if I ask you, have you been to the Limber Pine Grove? Because I only went about 2 years ago for the first time. And when I went, I was humbled, because this is one of the most beautiful places in America. And it's just a little trail that goes off of a little back road, but it's not very far. It's maybe an hour and a half from Denver, a little further for you. But you just go on this little bridge. It looks much worse than it is. It's actually quite wide. You cross the stream there, and you go up into this spruce woodland, and you wander, and you start seeing these behemoths, these extraordinary trees, and some of them are just barely alive with the little twigs. Some of them have probably been dead for thousands of years, and there are just hundreds and hundreds of them all over the slope. And for me, going to a place like this, wandering like this, I've taken tours now for the Botanic Gardens on several occasions, and I've taken many, many of my friends there. It is one of the places where you suddenly realize why you live in Colorado. And this is my favorite tree there. Every time I go there, I'm humbled. That tree is thousands of years old, who knows? I don't think it's been dated yet, but it's enormous. It has a trunk that's probably 3 or 4 feet high. It would look so good in my front yard, but I don't think it's going to end up there. But anyway, and this is the gentleman who's been guiding us on the staff to all these places. The other place, how many of you have been to Windy Ridge? It's on the shoulder. I see some hands here. Windy Ridge is above the town of Alma. That's Alma down below there on Mount Bross. It's right at tree line. It is an enormous area. It's this huge ridge that goes on for about a mile, and it's covered with the most unbelievable trees that you'll ever see. These are all Bristlecone Pines. Now, it's about maybe a half an hour from the Limber Pine Grove, but these are all different trees here. And just here is see, there's the bristle, in case you were wondering why they call them Bristlecone Pines. This is to prove to you. And notice also that they have the speckling, the dandruff. I grew up about 6 blocks away from Dana Bailey And he was a diplomat. He worked for the diplomatic services, but his hobby was collecting pines and studying them. And he was the one who named the California Bristlecone Pine. Way back in the 1960s, he distinguished it from our Colorado Bristlecone Pine. And one of the distinguishing features, of course, is that ours almost always has that dandruff that unscrupulous landscapers have been known to tell people, I'll spray your tree. Don't be fooled. It's supposed to be there. They're actually resin ducts. But our Colorado bristlecone only has a single vascular vessel on each leaf. The California one has two, but there's many other subtle distinctions. Ours was named first. Theirs, unfortunately, is older, but we'll quietly ignore that. But these are all specimens, and it's wonderful to watch somebody like Jerry Morris, who is the original green man. When you're with him, you feel like you're with a wonderful sprite of the forest. And there he is. And notice these pictures. I took these pictures, and each one of them, he has his arm kind of the same angle as the branch. And he seems to kind of blend in with the trees. And this is, what can I say? He's a hero. But if you get a chance to go to Windy Ridge is without a doubt one of the greatest treasures of Colorado. It's not a national park. When you go up there, you probably won't have any other company. You will need a four-wheel drive because it's a rugged blue road, but boy, is it worth going up there. What an inspiring sight. Well, it's quite a leap from Windy Ridge to Denver Botanic Gardens. But I trust that most of you have been to the gardens, and most of you know the Japanese garden at the Botanic Gardens has pines, several hundred incredible character pines. And many of these pines are hundreds of years old. And for years I've been curious, where did they come from? Well, it turns out the fellow we have who oversees our Japanese garden, a retired teacher, was one of the few people living today who was part of the harvesting of those trees. So I said, can you take me to where those trees came from? Because I was curious. Number one, we have got hundreds of trees up there. Are there any left? What kind of environmental degradation did we do? So I was kind of going up there kind of concerned. Well, he took us up about 3 months ago to a place called Ironclad Ridge. And this is a very sacred place for the Japanese community of Colorado because they have taken thousands of trees out of here with permits. But it is such a vast area. It's due west of here, probably only about 25 miles or so. It's national forest, and you have to have permits to collect the trees. But let me tell you, they have barely made a dent. So I had about 4 or 5 of my colleagues. We went up with Larry, and he showed us around. So the next few pictures, there you are, we're poking around, and these are the rocks where the trees were harvested. They harvested 200 and some trees. Not one died. And most of them because they picked them out of pockets where they were like in a pot. And they were able to lift them and move them and reestablish them. And those are the trees that now are featured in our Japanese garden. And, but there's still plenty up there on this high cold ridge that goes for miles and miles and miles. And just to let you know that they're not all pines. There's also some Douglas firs. And they have this wonderful character, even looking at them, but just to show you, a few of them are still dancing up on that ridge, like hundreds and hundreds. And it was such a pleasure to go up there and to find where our trees came from and realizing that there's still plenty of them up there. And plenty of them that will never be harvested because a lot of them, if their roots go into the rock, they won't try. They only get the ones that are budding. But look at how they just go on and on. I'm just doing a small selection. This one is creeping along the ground. It's just a flat on the ground. There's some really amazing ones. So isn't it interesting that some of our best plants in Denver came from Boulder County? But then so did I. So that's yeah. There is a wonderful relationship between Boulder and Denver. And I remember when I was a kid, Denver was this place, my God, it was so far away. And who on earth ever wants to go down there? It's so crazy, all those people and everything else. And I still have relatives who live in this area. And they'll invite us for for Christmas dinner, this, that, and the other. We said, why don't you come down to Denver? Oh, but it's so far to Denver, It's not far the other way, of course. Yeah, and so you've noticed that. So these are all pictures from Ironclad Ridge. So you can tell I enjoyed myself that day. It was one of those magical, perfect days. And this shows you how the trees are moved at the Botanic Gardens. We've had to move one or two of these trees. And let me tell you, it was a lot easier back when they did it originally 40-some years ago. When we move them now, it's quite a production. Because once or twice we've had to do some projects. And this is one of our trees being moved. And you can see they're doing it with religious zeal. And there's a glimpse of some of these character pines. So the next time you go to the Botanic Gardens, I hope you'll have a chance to really take a good look at them, because they have to trim the needles several times a year. There are many, many volunteers who will go out there and work on it and staff to keep them in character, because they're growing obviously in a very different environment in the city and the deeper, richer soils. But they are one of our, I would say, one of the greatest things of the Botanic Gardens. And it's something that a lot of the visitors don't really realize what we have there. And finally, I'm going to finish with 15 trees that I think we ought to be paying more attention to. And this is one of my very, very favorites. This is the big tooth maple, or Utah maple, or Wasatch maple. And it grows from British Columbia all the way down to Mexico in a strange little band, kind of a line that goes through the middle of Utah. It sneaks into Colorado only in a few little spots. But it is essentially, it's been lumped with the eastern sugar maple. But what it is it's a xeric sugar maple that grows on limestone. Most sugar maples don't like limey soils. So you can see this is a pretty wonderful tree for us. I have several growing in my yard where they get no supplemental irrigation. So they're growing without supplemental, and they're doing just fine, thank you. And of course, the fall color is wonderful. This is in the Betty Ford Garden in Vail, where they have dwarf forms. They've selected some miniature forms which they're growing on their rock wall. And if you go there at the right time of year, they are wonderful and very special plants. And this is a maple you're going to have a little trouble finding. I don't think it's ever been sold in the Denver area, but it is available mail order. This is a tree that I photographed a few years ago in Denver. It's about 60 feet tall, maybe only 50. It's about 100 years old, and it's never been watered. It is a Montpelier maple. It comes from southern Europe. If you look at the books, they tell you it's only about zone 7 hardy, 8 hardy. Well, fortunately, plants don't read books. And so this tree has been perfectly content in Denver, growing in a neglected yard, not far from the Botanic Gardens. And it's a weeper, and it is fantastic. This is a tree we should be planting because it's very xeric. We've been so impressed. We've obtained quite a few at the Botanic Gardens. All of them have turned out to be very reliable and hardy. So we're growing quite a few of these. You can get them mail order, but not any other way. But they have beautiful leaves. They've got a lovely trident leaf. This is an example of there are hundreds of spectacular trees that we should be growing, which we are not growing because our local nursery industry has not been seeking them out. Am I making too much noise?
It's making a lot of noise.
You know, it's my pants a bit.
Well,
Why don't I put it over here? Sorry about that. I'm so obsessed with the trees that I've neglected. I was scratching your ears out. Sorry. This is a cousin to the sugar maple called a black maple. And the black maples occur in the Midwest. And if you try growing sugar maples, they grow pretty well on the hill in Boulder where the soils are a little more acid and deep. But here in Denver, this one is probably about 80 feet tall and probably 50 feet across, and it is spectacular. They tolerate much hotter, drier conditions and do much better than the true sugar maple. So if you can seek out a black maple for a large tree, but they get monstrous, so make sure you have room for it. But this is on 26th Avenue and Colorado Boulevard, and it's one of my favorite trees in Denver. And this shows you the leaves are very, very similar. I've noticed that the nigrum leaves tend to be thicker than the true sugar maple, but they're very closely related. Essentially, the black maple is a limestone adapted, heat adapted sugar maple. This is our white fir. Of course, this is not a new tree that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this. This grows from Pikes Peak southward, and in the Great Basin in California, it grows all the way up to Oregon, I believe. And it has a very large range in nature. The really blue ones tend to come from Colorado, so there are quite a few selections that have been made. The one on the right-hand side is one called Candy Cans, pretty widely available in the trade. They do get big. They're kind of like a blue spruce, only they're soft to the touch, and they tend to be a little less fussy than blue spruces. I think most of us know that these are wonderful trees. The one on the left-hand side is growing in Franktown, south of Denver, without supplemental water in a friend's garden. And on the right-hand side, actually that's one I stole off the internet, so we'll sneak off here. Most of these are my own pictures. But I have to show you this. This isn't my friend Sandy Snyder. She worked with me for many years at the Botanic Gardens. She has a low dwarf mounding form, which I think is pretty cool. So it's worth looking for these special forms of these conifers, wherever you can. This is one I was very, very proud of for a long time because I had one that was about 2 feet tall, and I thought I have the best horseman's silverlock imaginable. It was just a perfect little tree in my rock garden. And then one day I was in my neighborhood walking along and I saw one that was about 15 feet tall, and I was not happy. That's the one on the right hand, that's this one here. And this is a Korean fir, and I always thought that you had to pamper them and you had to you know, feed them baby food and do all sorts of things. Well, it turns out it's on the south side of a house. It's in the wrong spot. I would have never put that plant there, and it's the happiest fir I've ever seen there, and it's been there forever. And they do actually sell these. I've actually seen these in box stores. But the next few firs I want to show you, there's about 6 firs, 7 firs that occur in extremely hot, dry areas around the Mediterranean, from Morocco and Spain to Greece and Turkey. And I took these pictures a few years ago. This is right outside of Athens on Mount Parnitha. This is Abies cephalonica, which is found usually at higher elevations in Greece, but I saw it growing in Athens, which in the summertime can be as bad as Phoenix. So this is a fir that we really should be looking for because it's certainly cold hardy. It grows in high mountains, but it also has great heat tolerance. And it has a hybrid between that and the Abies alba. Occurs only on a few mountains in central Greece, and I photographed Abies hybridogenus, which is a rare endemic and different in its look on Mount Olympus. And here is a fir that only grows above the site of ancient Troy on Kazda, the ancient Mount Ida. And it's a narrow endemic of only that mountain, different and distinct again. And finally, here is the Bithynian Olympus in Turkey, now called Uludağ. And the dominant tree there is another fir called Abies nordmanniana. All of these can be obtained mail order from specialty nurseries. And to my knowledge, none of them are currently growing in Colorado. So there's a huge opportunity to experiment and diversify our conifer flora. I was very fortunate 10 years ago, actually 9 years ago, to go to Mongolia. And when I was there, I was stunned by this tree. It grew everywhere. It grew in the dry areas of the steppe, it grew in the higher mountains, and it grew in almost alpine areas. This is Siberian larch. And this is one of the most beautiful specimens I saw. In the distance, I thought, what is that rugged tree? It looked like almost like some of the Bristlecone Pines in Colorado. And as I got near, here's the cones. And it was just an absolutely breathtaking specimen. And here are 2 of my companions, our tour, our guide, Vladimir Kolbintsev, and my colleague Mike Bone, standing next to one of these magnificent Siberian larches. We have several at the Botanic Gardens, and they've turned out to be really vigorous, tough trees. If you visit the Botanic Gardens, if you poke around, you will find many specimens. These are pictures I took at DBG a few years ago of our wonderful lacebark pine. This is found sporadically over a large swath of China, Manchuria, and I believe into Korea. And it is one of the most beautiful bark trees, and it makes for a pretty spectacular specimen. The champion specimen in Colorado is in Colorado Springs, that's probably about 60 or 70 years old. Unfortunately, we never have gotten any like the one on the left-hand side. That is the famous plant explorer Frank Meyer, standing next to one at the Princess Tombs outside of Peking. But I've seen these in China, and I couldn't find my picture to share with you, but I've seen some which have trunks that are 4 or 5 feet across, growing in some of the temples around Peking. But what a beautiful bark it has when it's younger. As it ages, the bark becomes more and more white. A beautiful tree. I have seen this being sold most years in some of the better nurseries in the Denver area. Now we're down to about number 8, 9 or 10, I think. This is Pinus heldrachii, being rather commonly sold. I've seen this quite often in the Denver area. And I have to warn you, it does get big. Because when you see it, it's usually a cute little tree about 4 or 5 feet tall. And you think, isn't that sweet? This is on Mount Olympus, where it grows on tree line. Look on the map there, you can actually see how incredibly, really rare it is in the Balkans. It's found mostly in the former Yugoslavia, but it does occur down in Greece as well, mostly on Mount Olympus, where it makes the dominant forest at tree line. And some of them were about 80 feet tall, and they must be ancient specimens. Just a beautiful tree. On the left-hand side, that is the state champion growing at Denver Botanic Gardens. You can see that they don't develop that character in the garden right away, but come back in a few hundred years. I think we'll have some really nice ones. And on the right-hand side, a few more of them growing on Mount Olympus. And this is another wonderful tree at Denver Botanic Gardens. This is our state champion table pine from China. This is a tree largely restricted in a big, broad swath of western China and northern China. And it makes for an incredible, often clumping tree like this. And here it is in nature, a photograph I got off the internet. I have not been to Huashan where that was photographed, but boy, would I love to. What a beautiful tree that is in nature. Finally, we're getting to a few non-conifers. This is the oak. And I'm very proud to say that I wrote a blog about this maybe 10 or 15 years ago where I said this is my favorite tree. And it created enough of a demand that most of the nurseries in Denver are now starting to stock this. This is the Texas oak. It's pretty much restricted to the hill country of the Edwards Plateau in nature. It's pretty restricted. That specimen started as a whip planted by one of my colleagues in the 1980s. It was a little tiny whip. It's now probably 40 or 50 feet tall. It has never had a drop of irrigation in its entire history. That tree is probably 35 years old now. It is magnificent, and it has beautiful fall color. Even in frosty years like this, it'll have good fall color in November. Wonderful tree. It looks very much, the foliage looks like a pin oak. People plant pin oaks, they need water, they need acid soil. If you look at them wrong, they'll die back, and they get yellow, and they get yellowish leaves from chlorosis. But the Texas oak, you can throw anything at it. It's tough as nails. So I highly recommend if you can obtain this. This is an oak we should be planting because it's an oak that can put up with the kinds of horrible changes that may be occurring if we don't watch out. And then finally, I mentioned elms in the beginning, that we lost many elms, but people started treating the elms with various kinds of insecticides. And many of our elms in Colorado survived. And as humans often do, they pretty much stopped doing that after a while. And somebody noticed that the elms were not dying anymore. And Whitney Cranshaw, our local a great expert, nationally and internationally acclaimed, and some other people did research, and they discovered that the beetle that carries the disease appears to be extinct in Colorado. So what you're looking at is the fact that American elms, we can probably start planting, even the ones that are not disease resistant. But this is one that survived all the ravages of the last 40 or 50 years. It is a weeping American elm at Regis University, and it is their champion. It's the champion weeping elm of Colorado. And I'm going to be finishing up with showing you this and one other tree. This is one of the great specimens. I took my colleagues one year to visit it when it was in peak collar. And there we are walking towards it, and now we're underneath it. And it was like being in a golden cathedral. And I can't imagine, even the most jaded anti-tree person, you put them in there and they can't help. But just look how they're standing in wonder. And I'll never forget, it was one of those magical days that I'll never forget. And you realize that our lives are haunted with memories of our friends and the people that we love, many of whom leave and are lost to us. But we also have these other companions that are silent sentinels of our daily lives, and that's the trees. And I'm finishing with one of the most magical experiences I ever had. I led a tour to South Africa 20 years ago, and the people who organized my tour had arranged for a hike. And it was late afternoon. I was thinking, why are we hiking on this mountain? And when we got to the top, the mountain was covered with wind-blown ancient baobabs. And we turned around and they had these incredible torches set up and a magnificent dinner under the baobabs as we watched the sun set. Thank you so much. And sorry about all the scratching. Great. I think they've saved a little time for some questions. Kathy, hi there. Good to see you.
Well, can you wait for the mic, please? We're recording this, and I just want to make sure that we get it.
I just wondered if we could get a copy of your 15 favorite trees.
Well, I think I maybe should do that, shouldn't I? Okay. What I do is I do have a blog. It's called Prairie Break. And I'll promise if you give me a week, I'll post the pictures of my 15 favorites and as one of my blog postings, if you don't mind. So just check. If you put my name, Panayoti, you obviously were able to find the program, Panayoti Kelaidis, and I'll put that in with a little thank you to all of you. So check in. Give me about a week. Okay.
Yeah, I'm curious to know your feeling about importing trees from elsewhere. We've had some bad successes with that, with invasive. They become invasive in this area or in other areas out of their range. So how do you look at that and ways to perhaps prevent that?
Yeah, I'm very much aware of the issues of invasiveness and the potential problems with importing diseases as well. I think that, there are rigorous protocols that an institution like Denver Botanic Gardens has to pursue. We obtain seed with permits from any country that we travel to. We have to go through a pretty rigorous process. Many trees we cannot import and we cannot obtain. They have to be done, for example, most prunus, salix. There's quite a few different kinds of trees you cannot bring into the United States unless you're a researcher who has a phenomenal amount of permitting to go through and special sites for quarantining. I agree. There's philosophical issues about should we grow exotic plants, should we grow native plants, what is the danger about invasives. For example, Russian olives have been perceived to be a terribly bad tree. And I have to admit that, I don't recommend that people use Russian olives. I think a lot of that, for example, they stopped removing Russian olives in parts of New Mexico because they found out an endangered bird had adapted to, that was their preferred habitat. Just like the eucalyptus in California, they were removing them until they found out if they removed the eucalyptus, they would lose the monarchs. because the monarchs had adapted to the eucalypts. And the plants become invasive, and obviously I think we have to be vigilant to not bring in trees that have a potential for that kind of invasiveness. But a lot of invasiveness is a function of mismanagement of landscape. And plants would not be invasive if we were not creating habitats that were ideal for plants to, for these so-called invasive plants to occupy. We do a phenomenal amount of bulldozing. We don't do a lot of revegetation. We don't do a lot of land management is fairly low on the list of priorities for our culture. So I wouldn't blame the plants entirely. I think obviously we've become alerted. I can give you a good example. Calorie pears. The calorie pears are now totally verboten in the eastern United States because they have become incredible pests in large areas of the east, but those are often areas that are mismanaged. And the calorie pear is just, it's trying to kind of repair the damages of human development. Okay, I don't recommend planting calorie pears in the eastern United States. I've never seen a seedling in Colorado. Now that doesn't mean that someday we won't start having seedlings here. Now, calorie pears are probably not the best choice for Colorado because when they bloom, they stink pretty bad. The flowers are bad. They don't bloom for very long. They're prone to all sorts of breakage. But you know, I've seen some beautiful specimens and they turn a deep maroon color in the late summer. So there's a two-edged sword. And the man who first introduced them, Frank Meyer, who you saw a picture of there, first collected them in China and brought them. And they were sitting around for a long time at the National Arboretum, and they were perfectly well behaved and things were just fine. And then a man named David Creech introduced them to general horticulture. And I was very lucky to get to know David, and he came and he gave a lecture in Denver about 1983 or 4. And none of my colleagues were clever enough to worm their way and get to know him. And I was able to introduce him and hang out with him for a day. One of the greatest American horticulturalists ever. He created the National Arboretum pretty much, and an arboretum down in North Carolina. And I was sitting there, when I introduced him, I said, this is David Creech. He's the man who introduced the calorie pears and all this sort of thing. And afterwards he leaned over and says, I wish you hadn't said that. Well, it took a while. And the trouble is that it takes a while for us to learn these things. But so many hurdles have been placed that I don't think we're going to be seeing a lot more of invasives like that. I think the big issue is that if you go to Long Beach, California, or if you go to the other great ports in America, you will see thousands of enormous containers that are coming in every day from all over the world to our ports. And very few of those containers are inspected. And those are not containers full of plants for gardens. They're containers full of all sorts of crap for our consumer culture. And that's how the stuff comes in. And until we start, we put all the kiboshes on horticulture, but we haven't put the kiboshes on all the other sources. Like I said, the Admiral ash borer came in on pallets, and likewise the other ones. So I don't think that a lot of that paranoia about horticulturists introducing plants, I think is misplaced. And I think the real problem is that we as a culture are not trying to revegetate responsibly and make sure that we don't create habitats for these plants to try and heal. That's what the weedy things are trying to do, and most of them don't persist. Because I've been accused, because I've introduced so many new plants, Native Plant Society people almost pelted me at one point when I get up to give a talk. And I remember, for example, the Dalmatian Toadflax. When I was a kid, there was the whole along Highway 119 down to one year I went, it was yellow. It looked like somebody had spray painted the whole mountains with Dalmatian Toadflax. And I thought, oh my God, what a horrible invasive plant this is. 3 or 4 years later, I was by the same time of year, and I looked, and I thought, where the hell did it go? And I went walking, and I couldn't find a single. Finally, I found one or two. Nature is full of these boom and bust cycles, and most of these so-called invasives are really pioneer plants that just sweep through, and they look horrifying, and everybody's going, oh my God, isn't this terrible? Well, in fact, The really terrible things is that in the last century, we have wiped out most of the wild areas of the world, and we're continuing to do that. And horticulture is one of the few means where we're actually trying to go out there and see what's there and what's lost. And I think that the real issue is the destruction of biodiversity. And that is ongoing and it's accelerating. And that is the problem. And horticulture is the cure. Thank you all very much.